Hi everyone, I'm Craig Griffin from Fuel Asia, a qualitative and cultural insight agency working across Asia. And about 3 months ago, I launched a campaign for Real Qual. And what began as an exploration of how AI and research tech are reshaping Qual has since evolved into a broader conversation about where Qual is heading in 2025 and beyond. At its core, the campaign is about protecting the craft of Qual, but it's not purist, it's also grounded in commercial reality. So we're not here to say this is right, this is wrong. We're really opening up space to reflect on the implications of how we're doing things these days as we're going through massive change. And today we're turning our attention to the discussion guide, especially the trend that Dave and I both observed towards longer, more detailed guides. And we're going to discuss today what that means for the practice of moderation, spontaneity, and ultimately insight. So joining me today is Dave McCaughan. Dave has 40 years of developing qual research projects across a dozen countries. And while at McCann, he ran a program of weekly qual groups in 20 cities across APAC for over 13 years. And he's personally moderated over 1,000 focus groups. Dave now works on all kinds of projects helping brands find their story with his consultancy, Bibliosexual. He's already contributed to the campaign with a brilliant piece on the importance of maintaining your original voice. If you haven't read that yet, I highly recommend it. So, Dave, welcome and thanks hugely for joining me today.
Good stuff, Craig. It's a great point to be discussed, and I love what you're doing with the campaign. Thanks for involving me with it all along the way.
Yeah, and thanks. I should acknowledge your support behind the scenes, particularly as we've kind of continuing it. So we're not just talking about AI, but general themes that you've been very supportive in encouraging me to continue it. So I really appreciate that. So we've both been around a while, and I think I know from our conversations that we've been influenced on, we have a point of view on discussion guides, which has developed in our formative years early in our careers. So what were you taught when you were learning the craft about how to write discussion guides?
Yeah, well, two things always stand out. Firstly, I know I've told you this story, Craig, before, but when I first accidentally got into the world of joined a big advertising agency, McCann in Sydney, and having been a librarian and never really involved in market research in terms of qual and quant, suddenly I was in the research department, being the researcher, going off and doing courses on qual and quant research. And I happened very early on to get in contact with a guy named Hugh Mackay, who, if you're from Australia, you would know him. He's sort of considered the father of social research in Australia. And in a discussion over a coffee one day, idiot me says to Hugh, like, you basically make a living out of doing focus groups. What's the secret of a great focus group? And he said, one question. I said, what do you mean? He goes, in the perfect focus group and the perfect moderator's guide, you only have one question. And you just ask this usually very open-ended question, and you keep on repeating the question and getting people to take the question wherever it goes, and preferably have the group talk amongst themselves about that question and what they're saying. And he said, to be honest, the second hour of any 2-hour focus group, if I'm the moderator and I have to say anything, I consider it a bad group, because that one question should have sparked a discussion that just goes on and everywhere. Not long afterwards, I was lucky enough to spend some time at McCann's London office, getting some training and learning about strategy planning and qual research and all sorts of things. And I was invited to go to a session at a particular organization, and one of the people at this round table talked about moderators' guides. And he didn't really go into the only one question thing, but his whole point was that realistically, a client should know, or what he said was the qualitative work that should be done with the client, where the researcher really finds out what is the question the client really wants answered, is the guide to the moderator's guide. And I thought that was really important too, because too often we spend more time debating with the client. Are we going to have 20 questions, 30 questions, whatever? But we're not really like honing in on what is the one big thing that they really want to find out about. And then how do we create a motorist guide that's going to get us there?
Mm, mm. That's that's a really interesting perspective, and I can, listening to that, I can hear similarities in my kind of formative years. And actually, the connection there is Australia, because I think a lot of where I learnt the true craft of qual was time I spent in Sydney, with the leading edge, and worked with a lot of brilliant people there. And listening, I think the ethos of what you're saying, the spirit, was in what I was learned, maybe slightly differently. Some of the key things that I remember was focusing on short discussion guides, not necessarily one question, but certainly, if you wrote anything, 3 pages at max, ideally 2 pages. If you went beyond that, you weren't really doing your job. You hadn't, to your point, you hadn't thought deeply enough about what the core questions that you were trying to answer. Yeah, using a shorthand style as well, rather than writing out the whole question, because at the end of the day, every moderator has a way of asking questions in their own way, and it's also easier for a moderator to work with a sort of shorthand style. But I think, to your point, the key learning was understanding that big picture. So the moderator should know, okay, what decisions is the client making for this job? What do they need to make? And what are those underlying 3 or 4 big juicy questions that are gonna lead to solving that problem, to making the correct decisions? So there was a lot more focus on briefing the moderator to internalize those really get in the client's world. And I think what that meant was, okay, you had a 2 page guide and there's some questions in there, but the moderator was very focused on those 2 or 3 big questions. And what that meant was their job was to deliver to that. It wasn't to answer the questions in the guide. It was to really get to the truth.
Yeah.
And that gave them a lot of permission, implicit, to go where they needed to go, and it was their hour and a half or 2 hours, whatever, and they were trusted to go off script as much as they needed to. The guide was just literally a guide. And
And
so that.
I think that term you just used, to go off script, is so important.
Hmm.
I can remember a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, during sort of the back end of the COVID era, and watching some focus groups. And after the first, and I was getting paid to literally watch 9 focus groups that were happening across 2 different countries here in Asia, right?
Hmm.
And I was just getting paid to watch the focus groups and give my opinion of what I thought was happening.
Hmm.
And after the first 2 groups, we have that inevitable thing that I personally find it super annoying, that after every group you have to have a discussion about what happened and everything, right? It's like, but anyway, we did have a discussion, and I pointed out, look, the problem we've got here is that we're not generating the people in the group, we're not generating them having a discussion. We're generating direct answers. Me as the moderator getting your answer, your answer, your answer, and then next question. And I said, simple qualitative methodology in a moderator's guide is, when I was teaching, when I worked for McCann and I was teaching people to be moderators, the thing I used to do was, here's the first question that you want to ask. And then
Hmm.
literally the next 5 questions are why, 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 why,
Hmm.
and why. Now, we all say this stuff. Every qualitative researcher I've ever met that's any good knows this, but they don't actually put it into the moderator's guide. And so what
Hmm.
then happens is that you skip the why, right? So,
Hmm.
you know, Craig, why are you wearing a grey t-shirt today? Well, it happened to be the one on the top of the pile. Yeah, but why was it the one on the top of the pile?
Yeah.
And we don't get it. And that's the way to get the context and to get qualitative research is all about what is the context, what's the meaning behind that something, what drove you to do that sort of thing. And you don't get that unless you have the space within the moderator's guide to actually get people to do that, to actually answer the whys, right? And then more importantly, if you're doing a focus group, getting the different members of the group to react. So Craig just told us he got the grey T-shirt because it was on the top of the pile. Mabel, what do you think of that?
Yeah.
Is that something that happens in your life, or what do you think of Craig? And it's like, and
Yeah.
that's when you start to
Hence the
pick up.
discussion that you mentioned, that's so important. Yeah. And I think as well, the why and the laddering. I mean, getting to someone's truth, can take some time, and you have to work hard as a moderator and keep going on a topic to really get underlying stuff that maybe is below the conscious awareness of someone as well.
Well,
So,
again, too few moderators' guides have any guidance as to how to react to facial expression,
mm,
interaction between people in the group, body language. Um,
mm,
and so, too many groups that you see, it's almost ignored. It's almost like, well, yep, but so wait a minute, did you watch the video of the focus group with no sound and just watch Craig's eyes during the course of the conversation to see which questions he was obviously paying attention to and which ones he was like falling asleep through? And then look at what he's answered, right? Well, we don't,
yeah,
we
yeah.
sort of learned that, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago when we first started videotaping focus groups. But we're not
Mm.
doing enough of that in the moderator's guide today.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. And I think we've both observed this, yeah, what's happening with guides from when we started to these days of increasingly sort of long and detailed guides. So I'm interested in your perspective on why do you think guides are getting longer? Um, and I'm
Um,
sure there are exceptions. I'm sure there are people that are still writing, short guides, but it's a general trend that we've both observed.
Well, in my experience, there's probably two main reasons for that. Well, three. The obvious reason is money, right? So people trying to do a lot of things in one piece of research because, well, that'll save us some budget. So Craig has decided he's going to do some focus groups on X, and then he tells the guy at the desk next to him, "I'm going to do these focus groups." And Dave, that guy on the next table says, "Oh, well, while you're doing those groups, could you ask these questions as well?" And then somebody
Mm,
else chimes in with some. So, some of it is just trying to be financially efficient, but in turn, you're being financially efficient, but actually being qualitatively inefficient, if you like.
yeah, yeah.
The second thing is that I think training is a big piece of that. And not trying to offend anybody either on the research side or the client side or whatever. I think training in qualitative research these days is very poor. Um, and it's amazing to me the number of times that, and Craig, you probably do this, you watch a lot of focus groups. Obviously you moderate some, you watch others, you commission others, you watch big companies and small agencies doing them, but you sit there with clients and you quite often um, understand that the clients themselves have never been trained really in the moderator's guide or what to
Mm,
expect from
mm,
a moderator's guide. That they've been trained on the basis of usually of quant research more than qual research, because in some ways, and I don't agree with this, but people seem to have a perception that quant research is more logical and easier to understand. And it's like, well, you just put a question. So it's like, and you answer A, B, C, or D, right? It's like those inane questions you see on LinkedIn all the time where people are putting up stupid surveys, right? Um,
mm.
so there's a lack of training. Um, but I also think there's also on the part of research people, let's face it, if you're in the market research game, and I sort of in that game myself, and there's a desperation, right? So there's a desperation of well, I guess I'll go along with the client because, I don't really want to pee them off, right, and get them upset by
Mm.
saying, no, this is ridiculous. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so it's very hard sometimes, right, to say, look, you've got 50 questions. It's 2 hours. You've got 50 questions. There are five people. That means they've got like less than 30 seconds for every answer individually and no time for cross-pollination or no time for going into depth about why they answered the question. And so really it's become, I don't know what you call it, Craig, glorified quant,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had sort of two thoughts just listening to that. One is it's almost like at times we're taking a quant approach to writing discussion guides. Obviously, quant is determined by its control and its specificness in the way that questions are asked. And some of that seems to be creeping through into discussion guides. And of course, that means that we have very packed discussion guides. And like you say, we're losing some time and space for sort of deep exploration. But yes, I agree. There's a commercial reality, and as an agency owner, yes, it's challenging to, when you need to keep winning projects, where do you sort of draw the line in sticking to, you sort of core principles, and where do you try and meet the client? And I'm just, I guess the question to me is where's the middle ground? Or is it a case of we, say, okay, we can do this, but this is the trade-off. This is what we're losing in doing this approach. So it is that's the thought in my mind now. Do we need to be more proactive in educating um, clients in the implications of going with a very broad guide covering lots, everything and everything? Do we need to be more proactive in saying, okay, we can do this, but this is the implication?
yeah, yes, yes, I think so. And I mean, I guess maybe this is one of the future stages of, the campaign itself is examples and case studies of the benefit of going deeper, maybe
Mm,
less questions going deeper, that get you to the results. In my experience, the great qualitative projects I've ever been involved in any form, have been ones that have thrown up results that we didn't really expect,
mm,
and led to something that made a big difference to the client in one way or another and their business in one way or another. And
mm,
invariably, that came from allowing the moderator to take discussions into tangents, into areas that were not expected. And,
mm,
Craig says something and you go, what? Sorry, can you explain that again? Sorry, where did that come from? Like, where did you get that idea from? Right. And then it goes down and down and down. And suddenly, and I'll always remember, for example, doing some work for Colgate many years ago, where before the term wellness was very trendy. And we did the focus groups in about 6 countries across Asia, but were literally about wellness. But we didn't even use the term wellness because in those days, nobody knew what that meant. But we were trying to
mm,
understand what wellness could mean. And we kept on coming up in focus groups in half a dozen places where somebody would eventually, if you dug deep enough, they'd say, well, real wellness would be if you could take my grandmother's soup and put it in a pill.
mm,
And that ended up leading to Dali toothpaste creating green tea toothpaste, which became and is the number one selling toothpaste in China today. Um,
mm,
but it's literally like, well, we wouldn't have asked, we did, that was nothing to do with the moderator's guide. That was just digging deeper and deeper and deeper into, well, what do you really mean? What makes you feel good? What about health? What would make you feel good about feeling good about yourself? And that led
mm,
and led
mm.
and led, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great example of where, yeah, where. you have got a project where there's space and time to allow that to happen. And yet maybe we need more conference papers or something showing, okay, here's a design where we left a lot of space to go where it needed to go. And this is where we got to to try and bring that back amongst those decision makers. A related question, I think we've talked about how a longer guide can impact a project, but how do you think it's impacted moderation and moderators in having to work with these longer guides? What do you see as the impact there?
Um, well, I guess of my own experience, two things have happened. One is that we've seen, um, I would guess, more shallow moderation and more shallow moderators. And that's not to pick on individuals, but just to say that because of the circumstances and because of what they're asked to do, they're not inclined to go deeper. They're not inclined to say, Craig, can you turn off that fake Fuel Asia background? Because I really want to see the room you're in and understand the environment that you're sitting in, right? Because that's not on the moderator's guide, so I'm not going to ask that, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you think about it, and I'm sure this was true when you started out, but when you were at Leading Edge in Sydney or, previous experiences, whatever, the really good qual researchers were never 22 years old, right? Qual research was one of those things that took a few years to really get into, and it involved a whole bunch of things about really understanding psychology and
Mm,
semiotics and ethnography, and a really good qual researcher is also an ethnographer, because they are literally sitting there, and while you're they are asking you why a grey t-shirt. I mean, one of the other things that Hugh McKay told me years and years ago was, if you're going to do a focus group, never do it around a table. What do you mean around a table? He says, if you're all sitting at a table, I can't see your feet. And it was that learning about, you can't really, you can't just, it's not about what's coming out of your mouth. It's not about the answer. It's about the tonality of the answer, the interchange of the answer, and all those sorts of things. And I just don't think that there are some great qualitative researchers that are probably going to watch this video, and that you and I know or don't know, whatever. But there are also a lot of people that are in qualitative research. They are not given the opportunity and the experience to really go deep enough.
Yeah, that's actually this future episode of the campaign. We'll have another guest, and we'll be talking about the skills development of junior moderators, because I think it's come up as obviously a key issue in the industry. So and that links nicely to that. I mean, just my thoughts on the moderator. I agree with what you said, and I've observed myself what can happen when you have a long guide, and it's almost like the moderator kind of thinks about their job differently. So they think their job is to cover everything in the guide, and to make sure they've covered everything in the guide. And in a way, in my way of thinking, it kind of lets them off the hook, because as long as they've asked everything in the guide, they've done their job. And I think I think there's fundamentally an issue with that, because the job of a moderator should be to answer those big questions and to get to a person's truth, or a group's truth, a cohort's group, a truth as best as possible in the time they've got. Not just see their role as, okay, making sure that we've covered all the questions. And apologies if that offends any moderators, but I think it has meant a subtle reshift over the years of the job of the moderator. And I think some of the ones we were with in the early days, they were probably the ones that would be delivering the insights at the end of the day. I think that's something else that's changed, maybe the compartmentalization of the roles. But I think some of those big heavyweight qualies in the old days, they were there from beginning to end. So they knew they had to deliver something really powerful at the end. So they had a lot more ownership in the moderation around making sure that what came out was really, was really going to support, really support the decision that needed to make, and there was going to be a strong narrative there and a good story to tell the client. And I feel that shifted. And certainly in the work we do, we try and, focus on making sure moderators understand that role. But I have observed this kind of shift. So, that's really interesting. Um, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We'll probably wrap up fairly soon, but maybe just to wrap up, Dave, what's one thing you think we should all remember when writing a discussion guide? What's the single most important thing we should remember?
That we're not after a direct answer. That what we're after is the answer behind the answer. And probing, prompting. You and I, before we started recording, was talking about some stuff, and we were talking about AI today. And one of the interesting things for me in the last 2 years has been the use of the word prompting. And we're all encouraged, trained, educated to prompt GPT or Proximity or whatever platform you're using, and da da da. And what we're learning is that there's a difference between asking a question and asking a prompt, right?
Mm.
Now, it's sort of interesting to me because I thought, wait a minute, maybe that is the thing about a moderator's guide. That what we should be doing is we're prompting, we're not asking questions. We're prompting a discussion. We're prompting, trying to find out deeper what is going on. And maybe if
Mm.
we took that mindset and reminded people, and by the way, as AI platforms, Qual AI platforms develop, that's also the case. It's not about feeding the platform, 2 pages of questions. It's here's what we will find out. We need to generate the right prompts to go as deep as we can in that area. And
Mm.
by the way, maybe that platforms will teach us the right questions to get to those prompts. But it is about prompting. It's not about asking a question. It's about prompting a discussion or prompting, ideas around a subject. And I think
Yeah,
that's
that's a really nice reframe, actually, to think of it as prompts and not questions. And that really is what we talked about in the first part, where you shared about the role of a guide. So that kind of fits nicely. I think from my side, um, the single most important thing, I think, is the time and space issue, to allow some time, not to go too broad, but to allow time to explore something very well and not explore a lot of things at a very surface level, because then I think we're diluting what real qual is. And that would be my single take. So that's a wrap for today. Thank you very much, Dave, for not just joining today, but for being part of the campaign since the stage one. And I hope we'll see you again. I know you have a lot of views on different things, so I'm sure you'll be joining
why shut
again.
me up. I have to say, I have been a participant in half a dozen focus groups over the years. Uh,
Mm.
they made a big mistake getting me into the focus group because
Well,
any
I'm sure
moderator
has
has to keep me on track. So
So, yeah, thanks, Dave. I'd invite listeners to share their own experiences. This is just our kind of hypothesis of a chat over a coffee, that guides seem to be getting longer. Is this something that you've seen as well? And how have you found this, and how have you worked around sort of longer guides? Also, just a reminder that this is a community-led sort of initiative, the Campaign for Real Qual. So if you have an idea that you think we should be talking about that's relevant in Qual, not just AI now, but anything, please let us know. And of course, if you want to be part of that conversation and have a chat or write something or whatever format, please come forward. Very open ideas. So with that in mind, thanks very much again to Dave for kicking off this stage two with a new format, and we'll see you in the next episode with another guest.